world. So, we were talking about trade, which brought wealth to northern Italian cities, leading to the Renaissance. Gold was coming into Western Europe from West Africa. Spices came from around the Indian Ocean. Textiles, another word for fabric, came from India, China, and the Middle East. Porcelain came from China and later from Persia. And amber and furs came from the Baltic region. Baltic is Northern Europe and Russia. Technology was also introduced as a result of the Crusades and as a result of trade. Paper from wood pulp came from China. The compass was an invention that came from China. New crops were introduced from India. The water wheel and windmill was introduced from the Middle East. And the lateen sail was introduced from the Indian Ocean region. During the Middle Ages, most people could not read or write. Education was pretty much confined to the clergy. Nobility was concerned with feudal obligations. Serfs were concerned with survival. But people in the church could read or write and often spent their time copying texts. They were preserving Greco Roman texts. They worked in monasteries. They kept alive some of the works of Greece and Rome. So the Crusades, which were fought in the Middle Ages over control of the city of Jerusalem, is going to lead to more trade between Western Europe and the Middle East. Also, crusaders who had traveled to the Middle East learned about new knowledge. And so we have ideas spreading into Europe from other parts of the world. We have books being copied from the Byzantine Empire and Arabian libraries. We have new technologies being introduced to Western Europe from the Far East, such as gunpowder and the compass, paper, and in time we'll have a printing press invented in Northern Europe. We have new learning, more exposure to knowledge of Greece, Rome, the Arabs, people from India, and people from China. This had not been available in Europe before the Crusades. We have philosophy, medicine, science, and because crusaders traveled to the Middle East, they're being exposed to the inventions and ideas of the Muslim Empire and from the Far East. This will lay the foundations for the rise of universities in Europe. You need to know that crusades increase trade, which increases wealth in northern Italy. New products result, wealth increases, and we have political power of merchants in northern Italy. The Crusades exposed Europeans to new learning and new technologies, leading to the creation of universities and an increase in trade. We're going to talk about where the Renaissance begins and how art changes as a result of the Renaissance. And we'll talk about the Italian masters and see some of their masterpieces. Many people credit trade with bringing money into northern Italy, and that helps fuel the Renaissance. Trade cities formed. Important trade cities in northern Italy were Genoa, Florence, and Venice. Trade was coming through Asia and Constantinople into Europe, and much of this trade was coming through northern Italy. During the Renaissance, we have new ideas as far as art. We have perspective, making distant objects smaller through by what's in the distance is going to be smaller, what's in the foreground is going to be larger. This is going to make the art look more realistic. During the Middle Ages, the art was predominantly about the church and salvation. During this time period known as the Renaissance, that starts in the 1300s in northern Italy, we have more variety of artwork. Some art focuses on individuals and worldly matters, but we still have art about the church. Renaissance means rebirth. Some historians say the modern world begins at this time. When you think of the Renaissance, think of art and learning. And most people say it starts in Florence. Florence was a trade city in northern Italy. Money brought into Italy from trade led to some people becoming really wealthy. Some merchants and bankers decided to fund artists. If somebody gives you art or gives you money to make art full time, you can get really good at your craft. And that's something that was happening in Florence and some other northern Italian cities. Humanism is also associated with the Renaissance. Humanism is learning about people, not just the church. We have a renewed interest in ancient Greece and Rome. We have new innovations in art, trade, and we have an expansion of capitalism that all result during this Renaissance time period. Humanism is a focus on worldly subjects rather than religious. Now, some people were still concerned with the church. Most people in Western Europe were devout Catholics, they were Christian, but they weren't as focused on the church as they had been during the Middle Ages. They were also learning about ancient Greece and Rome, and they were learning about art and humans and different human accomplishments. Art was supported by wealthy patrons. A patron was somebody who supported someone else financially. Some wealthy merchants became patrons of the arts. We have artists in the Renaissance that will influence art in the future. Leonardo da Vinci was an artist who painted Mona Lisa. Make sure you recognize this piece of art. It's pictured to the right. So, Mona Lisa, you can notice, you can see emotion in her face. You can see details. This is very realistic. It almost looks like a photograph. What's in the background is smaller than what's in the front. That's depth of field or perspective. And we also notice that in the Last Supper, which is pictured beneath. In the Last Supper, you can see what's in the background looks smaller than what's in the foreground. It's more realistic than art of the Middle Ages is. This is known as perspective or depth of field. Maybe you call it 3D. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just an artist, he was also a scientist, a poet, an engineer. He came up with many different ideas and designs. He kept a notebook and wrote different ideas he had and made sketches of inventions he had. Now, in his notebook, he apparently wrote backwards, so if somebody stole this notebook, it would be hard for them to figure out what he was writing. He also would put a flaw in each of his pictures, so if somebody stole the notebook and tried to replicate what he designed, it wouldn't work out. Michelangelo is another artist we associate with the Italian Renaissance. His statue of the David was made of marble, and his Sistine Chapel was a painting, or he painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with many different Bible stories. Donatello was another Renaissance artist. He did a smaller statue of the David, and his statue was bronze. Raphael is another Renaissance artist. This painting that Raphael did is known as the School of Athens. It looks like the word Athens is hidden under the painting, but make sure you write it's the School of Athens. Make sure you can recognize Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, the School of Athens, and you know who the artists were, the David and ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as well. This is Brunelleschi's dome. There was a church built in Florence, and for many years there was not a dome, not a top on that cathedral. Well, they held a contest, and this guy Brunelleschi won it, so he was the one allowed to construct and design the way the dome would be. So it's known as Brunelleschi's dome. And when you think of the city of Florence, think of this dome and think of this view. There were also writers during the Italian Renaissance. Machiavelli wrote The Prince. In The Prince, he argued that the ends justifies the means. He said that keeping power is the ultimate end and argued in support of an absolute ruler. He thought you should just have one ruler and they should be the boss. He wasn't even a ruler himself. Petrarch was another Renaissance writer. Sometimes he's considered the founder of the Renaissance or the father of humanism. He also wrote sonnets, 14-line poems. So, this is the end of one section of notes. You are going to continue on to that next page of notes that's just a single page, and we are going to continue on with our talk of the Renaissance. Some highlights, hopefully you remember that the Renaissance started in northern Italy. Florence is often seen as the center of the Renaissance, but Venice and Genoa were also important Renaissance cities. Now, ideas of the Renaissance are going to spread north along trade routes, like so much else. When you think of the Renaissance, it's often seen as the beginning of modern times, the end of the Middle Ages, and it's a time of art and learning and literacy. Think about those Renaissance artists. Maybe they sound sort of like some turtles, but Donatello, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael were Renaissance artists. So the Renaissance moves north on trade routes. We're going to talk about where the Northern Renaissance begins, important figures of the Northern Renaissance, and some important technology that comes from the Northern Renaissance. So the center of the Northern Renaissance is going to be Flanders. So when you think of the center of the Italian Renaissance, you think of Florence, but the center of the Northern Renaissance is going to be Flanders. We have a growing wealth of merchants in northern Italy or northern Europe as well as Italy, and these ideas are going to spread on trade routes. So we're going to have art becoming important and learning about ancient Greece and Rome sort of having revitalization in other parts of Europe as well. We're going to have humanist writers in the Northern Renaissance. Erasmus wrote Praise of Folly. He was a Dutch humanist, and he was critical of the Catholic Church. Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia about his idea of a perfect world. Sir Thomas More lived in England. Now, he based his ideas on Plato's The Republic. Remember Plato? The guy back in Greece who thought that philosophers should be the rulers? Well, Sir Thomas More was reading what Plato wrote, as were other people in Europe during the Renaissance. William Shakespeare, you've probably heard of him. He lived in England during the Renaissance. Now, Queen Elizabeth was the queen for much of his life, and so it's known as the Elizabethan Renaissance. So the Renaissance spreads all the way to England, but most people say it doesn't start in England until 1485, so it's spreading north gradually. Now, Shakespeare was a playwright, and he wrote classics such as Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar. Cervantes is another writer of Western Europe during the Renaissance. He was Spanish, and he wrote Don Quixote. In the Northern Renaissance, we continue to have art. We have Dürer, who created wood carvings and designs etched onto a metal plate, using acid to do that etchings. And we have an invention that changes the world in the Northern Renaissance. This is a big deal. It's sort of like the internet back in the Renaissance. We have this guy, Johann Gutenberg, sometimes called Johannes Gutenberg, and he lived in what is now the country of Germany. It wasn't Germany yet. Germany's not going to form until the 1800s as a nation state. But Johann Gutenberg lived in what we'll call Germany. He's going to invent the movable type printing press. He's going to realize that if he puts a bunch of letters down, then he can make multiple copies using a press, and it's going to make it much faster to copy books. Before this, in Western Europe, they were hand copying all the books they wrote. So it still took a long time, but it's going to reduce the time drastically. Now, if you can make books faster, you're going to be able to drop the price. More people could afford books. You might not be influenced to read if you don't have any books to read, but if you can afford a book, that might be some motivation to help you learn how to read. So, when Gutenberg makes this invention of the movable printing press, it's going to lead to an increase in literacy in Western Europe. There will be more books and pamphlets in circulation. Everything's not handwritten anymore. Now, the first book printed in its entirety on this printing press was the Bible. Because of the printing press, we have ideas spreading through Europe. We have more literacy. More people can read because there are books out there that they can afford. So Renaissance follows ideas on trade routes. It starts in northern Italy, but it spreads north to northern parts of Europe. The Northern Renaissance also has writers and artists. A lot of the paintings of the Northern Renaissance have brighter colors. We have a lot of writers in the Northern Renaissance. We have humanism, but we also have religious subjects. People were still Christian, and that was still important to them. Make sure you think of Johann Gutenberg and that invention that changes the world. The printing press will lead to more books in print, more people wanting to learn how to read so they can read those books because books were more affordable since you could make them cheap quicker. Three authors you want to associate with the Northern Renaissance were Erasmus, who wrote Praise of Folly, Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, and Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the Renaissance. I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of this art. We'll talk